because I had the spray guide up too. It's on my other screen. All right, so it is almost fire blight season, and this is the time of year that we talk about fire blight. And so we decided that today we would talk about fire blight yet again. So for those who either don't know the life cycle of the fire blight bacterium, or more importantly, those who hear it every year and then forget because it's just once a year we really talk about it, we'll go through the life cycle again. There's no harm in being confused because this is really, you know, I can talk about this and it seems really cut and dry, but it's not. Fire blight management. Fire blight is the #1 disease in apple in Kentucky and actually across the US. And it's really hard to manage because it's really weather dependent, and we'll see that. So I'm going to talk about basically the life cycle of, oh, sorry, I forgot to, here we go. All right, so we're going to talk about the life cycle of fire blight. So let's go with the biology, and don't roll your eyes. The biology is really important in how we understand the way this bacterium works. So like I said, fire blight is caused by the bacterium Erwinia amylavera. It is a bacterium, it's not a fungus. Most of the other diseases that we battle in apple are fungal. So we're not using a traditional fungicide in the traditional way when we're dealing with fire blight. That's what makes it so tricky. The bacterium is driven by warm spring temperatures and water. That could be high humidity or it can be rain. And it is all, and you'll see we spend our springtime, the next 4 weeks, we're going to spend looking at the weather because rain and leaf wetness and blossom wetness is really driving this entire process. As temperatures start bumping up to 65 and 70 degrees, the bacterium is happy, and that's when it does the most of its multiplying. And so that's going to be the life cycle we'll talk about. I already said this, most common disease of apple, most destructive disease in apple. Fire blight can kill entire trees for the most susceptible trees. It can definitely take out limbs and take out fruiting branches. The bacterium overwinters in dead wood and in cankers, so that is part of this process. This is the time of year that you've been pruning, you're finishing up with your pruning, and removing any fire blight infected wood is going to be your first step. And then from there, we do this very delicate dance of spraying when temperatures are within range and we have water, we have free water available. So #1, early spring. So we're assuming everyone is finished pruning. So in early spring, your trees are here outside now. It is, I don't know, the low last night I think was 58 here in Lexington, and today's high, I don't know. I'm wearing a light jacket, so it's at least in the 60s today. So just right on track for this this bacterium to be really multiplying. It can multiply at temperatures as low as 45 degrees, but these optimal temperatures of 60 to 70 is when we really see a lot of growth from this bacterium. So what's happening is your trees are dormant, but that canker is not dormant. That canker has broken its dormancy, and those bacterial cells are active. And so those bacterial cells will start to double. So every cell becomes 2 cells every 20 minutes in weather like today. And so think about how many cells. So we start out with a few cells and we end up with millions of cells. So these bacterial cells, they just keep multiplying there on the surface of the canker or on the tip blighted wood. So any fire blight infected wood, that is ground zero for bacterial multiplication. And it's those bacterial cells there on that surface that are waiting in the wings for blossom. So that's what's happening. So we need only 2 hours of wetness and 65 to 70 degrees to get that doubling every 20 minutes. So that's what's happening outside right now as we speak. The wetter it is, the more these bacterial cells will multiply, the warmer it is. And I'm talking warm in the context of springtime warm. So as we get up to that 70-degree mark, 60s and 70s, so the warmer it is, the wetter it is, the more bacterial cells will multiply. And it's this colonization on the outside of this canker or this fire blight infected tips that is going to be what we measure as risk. This is the danger point. And this is the point where you are going to start your fire blight management program, okay? This is what you have to know. And by knowing this, so everybody thinks about fire blight in June when we start seeing the tip blight phase, the shepherd's crook. It's not. This is the time of year that we're going to start our fire blight management program. All right, so then those bacterial cells are waiting in the wings and they are waiting for a bloom. That is where they're going to make their first infection of the season, and we call that bud blight phase. So just as those buds break, if those temperatures are optimal and those bacterial cells are sitting there on that canker waiting to be blown or splashed around, carried around by insects. Even I read a really good study last summer on flies and the movement of bacterial cells by flies in the orchard, and that may be even more, they may carry even more cells to flowers than honeybees. So that was a very interesting study. But anyway, so insects can carry around the bacterial cells. Any rain splash, wind-driven rain can move these bacterial cells around within the canopy or from tree to tree. An infected blossom is going to die right away, and we call that blight. Quick death means blight. This image shows a blighted cluster of blossoms, or those are small fruit. So it means quick death. So a blighted blossom, you're going to see that if you're a orchard grower who is really diligent and you're always in your orchard, you're going to see that. You'll see them kind of die back and turn brown. If there is some infection, but we haven't reached the area of blight yet, that flower will hang on a bit. So anyway, the infected blossom serves as your next step for the disease process. So this is step one. This is the first step. If this doesn't happen, you have a lesser risk of what happens next. So protecting your blossoms is what we do the most. This is what you see in the spray guide. This is where you're going to use your antibiotics to protect your blooms. So this is step number 2. So step number 1 is when we are going to tackle that those bacterial cells on that dormant canker or the dormant tree. This is step number 2, where your blossoms become infected. All right, so that infection goes from the blossom and it just carries itself down that spur, and it will infect the branch or twig, and that is going to cause that canker that I showed in my very first slide. And a canker is a stem lesion. That's all a canker is. So that canker will keep spreading and it'll keep growing as long as temperatures are in that ideal range. So until we get, by the time we get to 85 degrees in May or June, this canker is going to continue to grow. And the canker is going to girdle, meaning it's going to choke that branch, and everything above that canker can suddenly die. And when we call a blight, so this might be a tip blight or a branch blight. And what we mean by blight, again, is quick death. So the leaves will usually remain intact, and you'll see those dead leaves kind of hanging on. So this is the canker phase of fire blight. So it is step number 3. And then step number 4 is going to be, no, this is not step number 4. I'm sorry. I'm continuing talking here. So anyway, the bacteria, they continue to multiply. They multiply on the surfaces. They multiply in the wood and in the blossoms and spurs that they've infected. And they're just going to keep spreading around to other blooms. So we've got about a 4-week span of apple bloom in our orchards. And this is all happening within that 4-week time span. Bacteria, they multiply in rainy and warm weather, and they splash around and they move around with insects and they cause new infections. And this just keeps going as long as we're in bloom. And right after that, this is our fourth phase. This is the tip blight phase. This is when the newly growing branches will become infected from the tip in that meristematic tissue. The bacterial cells will enter through that meristematic tissue and they will move downward. And that is the tip blight phase. And that's what causes that shepherd's crook. Usually we see this, it's really dramatic in June. So we'll start seeing it in May, but it's June that it's really dramatic. And this is when we say, oh no, it was a bad fire blight season this year. Usually if there are, so the rainier it is and the more we're in that ideal temperature range, the more risk we have for tip blight. Once we hit 90 degrees, it all stops. It just shuts down really quickly. And usually by June, that's when we start getting drier as well. So when it gets hot and dry, it all shuts down and your fire blight season is basically over. The more rain though we have until we hit that point, the more bacterial cells will be produced, and the more bacterial cells, the more risk we have for infection. And so that's the cycle, okay? And if you have any questions, again, feel free to unmute yourself. All right, there are risks of fall infections. We need cool, wet temperatures for that bacterium to become active again. The fire blight bacterium does not care about what we see as seasons. It only cares about the weather. It cares about wetness and it cares about temperature, but most of the time our falls are very wet. And there is just not that actively growing tissue. There are definitely not blooms going on. So we don't see a lot of fall infections. Now and then we'll hit that perfect storm, but usually we do not. Okay, so what you need to know about fall is that the fire blight bacterium overwinters in that dead infected wood and in those cankers, which is that infection as well. It's going to overwinter. If it's in your orchard, it's going to overwinter. It doesn't care how low the temperatures drop in wintertime. It doesn't matter that it gets down to 0 degrees or 10 below. It is going to overwinter in that infected wood. Very important to know, because that takes us right back to the springtime where we see those bacterial cells colonizing on the outside of the canker. All right, so the cycle just goes around and around. That's how it works. So let's talk about management. All right, so number one, you know I love to talk about sanitation. Sanitation is critical to remove those sources for inoculum, getting them out of your orchard, particularly getting them out of your orchard in early spring. We're mostly past that point, everybody. Right now, we have active fire blight, so pruning should have happened already, but removing any source of canker or twig blight, they have to go. Basically, you are going to prune 6 to 12 inches below that canker to make sure you get all of that infection. But remember, you need to prune properly. So you're going to go back to that branch union or whatever your pruning strategy is. So don't just measure 6 to 12 inches below the canker, but actually give a solid pruning cut. So your goal also is to prune for air circulation. The more we circulate air, the less humidity builds up in those canopies, and it will lower the amount of that free water that the bacterium needs. And then finally, do not throw these cuttings on the ground, because an infected limb on the ground is going to release the same number of bacterial cells as one that's attached to the tree. So those bacterial cells are still there. They are still going to emerge with the wetness and the moderate temperatures that are going to be happening. So whether it's on the ground or on the tree, it's going to be infective. So you've got to get it out of there. And then to avoiding rapid growth, remember I talked about the tip blight phase. It's that actively growing shoot that's also at risk for infection later in the spring. So over-fertilization will induce active growth. Aggressive pruning during the growing season will induce active growth later in the summer and fall. So that might cause a risk in the fall for infection. And then I'm going to mention this a little bit later. A growth regulator such as apogee at bloom will help reduce that active growth that will suppress tip blight. All right, so again, pruning, really important not to prune while the pathogen is active. Those bacterial cells move around in anything that's wet. That includes sap, that includes wet hands and wet tools. So you don't want to move it around. So you always want to prune before the pathogen is active in the springtime. So usually you're pruning in February. As we get into March, we're starting to risk all of these warm, wet days. Your goal is to remove dead, dying, and diseased wood during dormancy when it's cold. And you are trying to remove all sources for inoculum. Okay, for anybody who has 10 backyard trees, that is easy peasy, right? We can go in and we can examine every branch and every canker, and we can make all the right pruning cuts. The larger your orchard is, the faster you're going. It gets harder, I realize that, but your goal is to remove all sources for inoculum. You're going to prune at least 6 to 8 or 6 to 12 inches below the canker, ideally at the branch union. And then you're going to haul off and destroy any pruned material. It's got to go. It can't drop to the ground. All right, so if you have a newly established orchard, I can justify pruning during the season. Some suggestions are to disinfest tools in between each and every cut, to break versus prune initially, or what some people do is just paint those areas so that they can come back and find those infected areas later in the summer when things are drier. So ideally, you should wait and not prune fire blight out, except for in the winter. But if you've got a young tree and that fire blight is moving really fast, you might have to get out there and do some pruning. Again, very selective when you would prune outside of that winter dormancy season. All right, and here's what you're all here for: bactericides. Bactericides, remember, are not fungicides. Your bactericides are your coppers or your streptomycin and your oxytetracycline. So first of all, silver tip to 1/4 inch green. That's what, if anybody was on earlier and heard us chattering, I was asking about the status of apple and pear in the state. I usually think about the southwestern part of the state as some of those first blooms. So that's why I was asking. So silver tip to 1/4 inch green, which we are approaching really fast. This is when we're going to apply copper. Copper is an antimicrobial, and what copper does is it knocks back those bacterial cells that are residing on the outside of that canker. It's not penetrating that canker at all, but it keeps knocking back the bacterial cells that are there waiting in the wings. So if we're waiting for copper as close as we can to bloom, but of course there's that phytotoxicity associated with copper. So you're doing that. This is balancing act. There's absolutely an art to it. And of course, you know, you blink one day you're at silver tip and the next day you're at 1/2 inch green. So be careful of your timing there. But your goal is to use copper to knock back your bacterial cells that are residing or multiplying on the surface of that canker. The fewer bacterial cells that are there on that canker, the fewer that are available to splash to bloom, which is the next phase. All right, then at bloom, we're going to start with our antibiotics. Streptomycin is the gold standard. That's what we all use. Oxytetracycline and some of the newer products, they are promoted, especially where there's resistance. We do not have resistance in Kentucky. So streptomycin is applied every 4 to 5 days. You can stretch that out if it's drier. You cannot apply it more than every 4 days, as per label. but you're going to use your weather model to know what the weather is. So you may stretch out a little bit more so that you can time your next application closer to, for instance, a rain event. So you're going to use the weather model to take a look at when your risk. So we have a 5-year prediction on our weather model. And I will put that link in the chat box after this talk, so everybody will have it. So using the weather model, and then when you use streptomycin, to use Regulate as an activator. Regulate, so with Regulate, you are going to reduce the amount of streptomycin from 1.5 pounds to 1 pound, and then add a pint of Regulate. And our colleagues in other states are saying this is really improves the streptomycin efficacy. Streptomycin will remain, it will go systemic in the bloom, so it will remain there for about 4 or 5 days. Okay, and then the third phase is the shoot phase. And for the shoot blight phase, there's nothing that we can do once shoot blight begins. If you have an aggressively growing orchard or tree cultivars, to use Apogee, which is a growth regulator, at king bloom to petal fall. So applying it, and you will see it takes a couple of weeks for it to actually become active, but it will slow down that aggressive growth later in May, which is when the shoots become infected for that last phase. All right, so summary. Your risk for fire blight is highest during bloom, and your bloom season is about 4 weeks long. Wet and humid conditions are prime. Warm temperature, especially warm over time, is going to be when your risk is highest. If we get a 20-something degree night, or even our temperatures are in the 30s, that slows that bacterium down. Anything below freezing is going to kill the bacterial cells that are on the surface of the canker. It's not going to kill the bacterial cells that are in that canker. So just as soon as temperatures warm up again, those bacterial cells are going to start oozing right back out of those cankers. So there is that freeze and multiplication phase that goes on between, say, mid-March and the time we first start seeing bloom. So anytime there's cold weather, it will knock them back, but it will not stop the cycle. All right. Very important, I highly recommend that everybody use the ag weather model. Again, I will put, we have a publication that explains how to use it, and I will also put the link to the model. We have a mobile version, so it looks better on your cell or your tablet. So I will put those in the chat later. All right, and then think about your local conditions. Which cultivars do you have in your orchard? Which ones are most susceptible to fire blight? Which ones have tolerance for fire blight? What about your rootstock? So we have susceptibility and tolerance, and susceptibility and resistance in rootstocks. Think about the age of your tree, the vigor of the trees, and the vigor of the orchard. How quickly is it growing? Again, new succulent tissue is more susceptible to fire blight than mature tissue. So finally, again, ask yourself, what's your risk? What's the history of fire blight in your orchard? That matters. If you have a history of fire blight, your risk is higher this year. What is the weather? Are the conditions outside optimal for the Erwinia bacterium? Again, today it is. So you have to ask yourself that on a daily basis as we go through our bloom period. What cultivars are in your orchard and how susceptible are they? So you're going to be more aggressive with those susceptible cultivars. Bactericides are required. There is just no way out of it. With homeowners, we can kind of dance between using copper and resistant cultivars. But in a commercial orchard, it's highly unlikely that you can actually manage it that way. Copper right now from between silvertip and 1/4 inch green is a no-brainer. It's cheap. It needs to be done. I highly recommend it. And then you need at least 2 streptomycin applications during bloom. Most people put more than that, but at least 2 during bloom. Watch your weather. Think about things like hailstorms later in the season when temperatures or conditions are optimal. And then if we have a late freeze event in the spring and we end up with some rat tail blooms, those are also susceptible to fire blight. So anytime there's bloom on the tree, you have susceptibility. So if we do have a late freeze, think about rat tail blooms as well as part of that bloom season. So, okay, I will take questions. Remind everybody that our website is plantpathology.ca.uky.edu. I also have alerts on Facebook, Twitter, and other social media sites. And I will also be posting the fire blight alerts or some general fire blight alerts to everybody by the listserv. Kentucky Pest News is our weekly newsletter. KentuckyPestNews.wordpress.com.